Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this edition of India and the World. We're going to give it a minute or so and then begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of India and the World webinar. I am Deep Pal. I'm a visiting scholar in the Asia program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. As concerns over the COVID-19 pandemic recede, countries in South Asia are facing a new set of challenges. These are brought about by global developments mostly. These range from high inflation, depleting foreign exchange reserves. We are also seeing political instability and domestic unrest in many countries. Now, what has also happened at the same time, very interestingly, is that while China has expended much time and energy to build relationships and inroads into South Asia over the last few years, we have seen them noticeably restrained during the current crisis. Through this webinar, we aim to understand what these developments mean for India's relationships with its neighbors, especially the impact of China's relationship with South Asian states, and if it is time to take a fresh look at India's engagement in the region. Joining me today are Ambassador TCA Raghavan, Nirupama Subramanian, and Sangeeta Thapliyal for a discussion on India's post-pandemic engagement in South Asia. With that, let me introduce our esteemed speakers. Ambassador TCA Raghavan retired from the Indian Foreign Service in December 2015. He is a former Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan. He was in that position between 2013 and 2015. During his last posting in New Delhi from 2007 to 2009 in the Ministry of External Affairs, he was Joint Secretary dealing with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. He was also the Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs from 2018 to 2021. He is also the author of Attendant Lords, Bairam Khan and Abdur Rahim, Courtiers and Poets in Mughal India, which was awarded the Muhammad Habib Model Prize by the Indian History Congress in December 2017. His next book was The People Next Door, The Curious History of India's Relations with Pakistan, again in 2017. And his latest book is titled History Men, Jadunath Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai, Raghubir Singh, and their quest for India's past, published in 2019. We have also with us Nirupama Subramanian, who is the national editor at the Indian Express. She writes on security and foreign policy. She did 2 tours of duty as foreign correspondent in Sri Lanka from 1996 and 2002, and in Pakistan from 2006 and 2010. She has continued to track developments in both countries very closely. In fact, she was in Sri Lanka just a couple of months ago in April this year to cover the economic crisis and the political churn. We also have with us Dr. Sangeeta Thapliyal, who is chairperson in the Center for Inner Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her primary area of research is on India's foreign policy, Hindu-Kush Himalayas, and Trans-Himalayan studies. She also works on water security in South Asia and SAARC. Before joining JNU, she was professor in the Department of Strategic and Regional Studies, Jammu University. She has also worked with the Observer Research Foundation, Delhi Policy Group, and the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining this conversation. So the way we are going to do this, for those of us, those of you who have joined us on Zoom or YouTube or any of the other social media accounts of Carnegie India, please keep your questions coming. You can submit them either through the question and answer box on Zoom or through the comment box in the various social media platforms. Please mention the speaker you're directing your question to, and our team will pass them on to me, and we will work that into the conversation. We will first go around the room with a series of questions for our guests, and then we will start taking questions from the audience. Ambassador Raghavan, if I can start with you, the basic question is with Pakistan, what does this change in government in Islamabad mean for India? I mean, every time there is a change in government, we expect some kind of a change in the bilateral relationship. How far do you see that happening at the current moment?
It's very difficult to predict what will happen in India-Pakistan relations. But quite frankly, given the kind of internal situation which exists in Pakistan today, any major change in bilateral relations with India appears somewhat distant. It is a fact that the change in the government itself has, to an extent, reduced the level of polemics and tensions that had existed in the past. But it is also a case that a certain element of stability had crept into India-Pakistan relations over the past year and a half, following the ceasefire of early 2001, and the fact that that ceasefire has, on the whole, held very well. So I would say overall, we are in a phase where Pakistan is going to remain self-engrossed with its numerous domestic issues, the economic problem, the political issues, the issues relating to some extent to Afghanistan. I don't see any major possibility of a breakthrough or a major initiative from the Pakistani side with regard to India-Pakistan relations. Whether there will be some thinking about taking steps because of this reduction in the level of polemics and intensity on our side with respect to Pakistan, I think it is too early to say. Possibly the government is still evaluating the direction in which events are going to go in Pakistan.
Okay. Nirupama, if I can come to you as someone who was in Sri Lanka very recently. Now, how would you break down the situation in Sri Lanka right now? How bad is this crisis, especially in view of the developments that we have seen recently, where there's even been a change in government?
Right. I think it remains bad. The change of government has brought about a certain element of stability, but I don't think there is acceptability of the change. There's no widespread acceptability of the change. It's seen as a cosmetic change within Sri Lanka. I think outside to the international community, it has played out better, because the new prime minister is seen as as capable. He has dealt with international organizations before, with lending institutions before. He has been prime minister earlier on several occasions, although each time his term was cut short for one reason or the other. So he's a seasoned politician, a veteran politician. He's been in public life for 40 years. So the international community sees this with more hope and optimism than the people in Sri Lanka themselves. The protests continue. The protests in Colombo continue. People want all change. They want Gotabaya Rajapaksa to go. He hasn't gone. That remains a big stumbling block as far as internal, the handling of the protests is concerned. And they really, I think that will continue to dictate the direction of the political direction of the country for the time being. On the other hand, there is the economic situation. I mean, these are twin crises. The political crisis came out of the economic crisis, and the economic crisis is there for everybody to see. It's quite bad. There is no fuel. There is no milk powder. There are other food shortages. there's no medicine. So these are the main things that are in short supply. There are no food riots. I mean, no one is. I think there were some early deaths as people waited in queues, but people are not dying of hunger. Everything is very expensive. Some people have said that food inflation or inflation is close to 100%. It has even been calculated at that. Everything is costly. The rupee has been devalued so much that it could, a loaf of bread now costs almost close to 500 rupees. So there are these problems. And there have been efforts by the international community to mitigate this. I think the government has been in talks with the IMF, but more to the point, I think India has reached out. India has infused a lot of money into Sri Lanka over the last 3 months. I think it's to the tune of, the credit lines are to the tune of $3.5 billion. That's a huge amount. And I don't think India has given that much money to anybody else in such a short time. And so that has mitigated things to a certain extent, but the problem is not going away. Sri Lanka is going to lead at least another, by calculations within their government, it's going to need about $4 to $5 billion to tide over the rest of the year, because Sri Lanka is an import-dependent economy. Everything is imported, including milk, and they have no money to import these items anymore. And as soon as he took over, Ranil Wickremesinghe was very clear that the problem is going to get worse before it gets better. He asked people to, be patient and bear with the government, and that he'll do everything he can. But I think patience is kind of running out. In one sense, but also I hear that people are adjusting to the lack of fuel. Fewer people are going out, for taking their vehicles out. People have adjusted to sort of, optimize their food resources, their medicines, all that. So all that has happened. So this is how it is right now.
Yeah, you talked about how Wickremesinghe is more acceptable internationally, and that would help. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But before that, because you brought in the question of India and the $3.5 billion so quickly, right? And what I'm trying to understand is this is a relationship that India has struggled with over the last quite a few years, right? I mean, during the Rajapaksa years earlier also, and even during this administration. And what I am trying to understand is what has changed, or if anything at all has changed in the relationship, if we are seeing a kind of a reorientation, because there must be somewhere a thinking that this is not just India pulling Sri Lanka out of a crisis or doing its best when a close neighbor and a partner is in trouble, right? Where does it go from here? Are we seeing the relationship reorient in a way? And what should we be looking out for if we're trying to understand that?
I think it's a great opportunity, although it's come in such bad circumstances for Sri Lanka itself. I think it's a great opportunity for the two countries to reorient, as you said, their relationship. Just immediately prior to this, what was it? There was a big distance between the two countries despite their proximity, because of the cancellation of projects by Sri Lanka, their proximity to China, the fact that they thought nothing of awarding a power project, a renewable energy project so close to the Tamil Nadu coast on the northern islands, 3 northern islands. So there were so many irritants in the relationship, and also one long-standing one long-standing demand by India, or a pressure point that India has tried to exert on Sri Lanka is the Tamil issue. And that too is unresolved in a sense. The LTT is no more, but the Tamil political resolution of the Tamil question still hangs in the air. So these were various things that were bothering the relationship, that were dogging the relationship, and kind of preventing us from going into the next level. In 2017, there was when Ranil Wickremesinghe was Prime Minister then too, and on a visit to India, there was a long list of things that India and Sri Lanka would do together. I think there were about 20, 25 MOUs in that list. And really none of them had moved at that time. From that time, they've been struggling. India has been struggling to persuade Sri Lanka to sign on at least a couple of those, and nothing moved. And then, of course, in 2021, at the beginning of 2021, they said that Sri Lanka unilaterally pulled out of a tripartite agreement with Japan and India for the joint development of a container terminal at Colombo Port, the East Container Terminal. They said, there was already a lot of opposition to it from the port workers unions and all that, and they said, well, it's just impossible for us to do, and they pulled out of it, and they asked us to take the West Container Terminal instead. And this was like a real slap in the face for India, and I think. At that point, things looked really bad, and we just drifted along till, I think, somewhere in September, the relationship seemed to have changed dramatically. And I wondered, no one can really put a finger on this. I've asked many people, but I think it was because, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's directive that the country should go organic meant that they needed organic fertilizer. They did not have organic fertilizer, and they had to import this once again from outside. And China offered to send a consignment of this organic fertilizer. It turned out to be contaminated. Sri Lanka ran some mandatory checks on it, and it turned out to be contaminated, and Sri Lanka refused to accept that consignment. The ship carrying that consignment went up and down the Sri Lankan coast, pressuring Sri Lanka to accept that consignment. And there was publicly the Chinese Foreign Ministry called out Sri Lanka for reneging on an agreement, very openly sort of saying that this is completely a wrong thing to do and should not have been done. It has destroyed the trust between the two countries, and so on and so forth. I'm thinking maybe that was a turning point at which, a lot of public opinion had also turned at that time, and they were thinking, hey, what is this? Why is China coming at us like this? So, and very soon after that, the then Finance Minister Basil Rajapaksa came to India and had free and frank talks, I would imagine, with the Foreign Minister and the Finance Minister, and as well as the Prime Minister, I think. I'm not sure he met the Prime Minister, but these two ministers definitely. And something was worked out, a package was worked out by which India agreed to help, but also I think laid down certain conditions for that help. And if you want me to tell you those things right now, I will, but maybe we can come back to it later. If you're running out of time, you can tell me.
No, we will in fact come back to that in a minute. But before that, I want to go to Dr. Thapliyal for a moment and talk about Nepal, where last month we saw some indications of economic trouble. Foreign exchange reserves getting depleted, and this is coming at a time, when the countries are just about managing to get out of the COVID-19 pandemic, but being hit by inflation as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. Soon after, we saw the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, visit Nepal as well. If you can put this in context of the developments we are seeing.
Well, situation in Nepal isn't that as bad as in Sri Lanka. So we did see decline in foreign exchange reserves. Two, three factors were responsible. First of all, the COVID issue, post-pandemic. Nepal has tourism is one of the major industry that was in Sri Lanka as well. So it definitely got affected by it. Second is the remittances. They get huge amount of remittances, and because of pandemic, many workers had come back to Nepal, and that also dropped foreign exchange that they had. However, and because of now Russia-Ukraine war, what we see that prices are increasing, fuel prices are increasing, and as a result, you see prices of all other goods items are equally, they are also rising in Nepal. So this has created dissent within Nepal, but situation isn't all that bad. Government has tried to take certain action. For example, very small measures. First of all, they removed their governor. So that was one thing. And they said that he was appointed by Prime Minister Oli, and now they want to have their own. So this was one. But this could be political as well as, but at the same time, seen as a measure taken by the government to take control of the situation. Second was that, they have also asked their citizens, those who are living abroad, to deposit money in domestic banks so that they have for their financial system has enough liquidity, and also to preserve foreign exchange reserves. Thirdly, they have also they've banned 10 items as of now, which are considered as non-essential luxury items. For example, alcohol, tobacco, cars, luxury items. So that till mid-July, so that they will take stock of that at a later date. And earlier, Nepal had 6 working holidays. Now they have reduced it to, 6 working days. Now they have reduced it to 5. So they will have holidays on Saturday and Sunday. Weekends are off now. So these are certain things so that, people, they're trying to conserve petroleum consumption. But that apart, their currency is pegged with Indian currency. It is 1:6 ratio. So as a result, it will prevent Nepali currency to fall. So that will take care of that, according to me. And India's, of course, they're helping them in whichever way India can. Prime Minister Modi also went there. A lot of agreements have been signed. And what we see is that now, after the change of government, Prime Minister Dioba also came to India. A few agreements were signed. In Prime Minister Modi is also. So there is now, that relationship has once again re-energized.
So, yeah, Sangeeta, the same question that I asked Nirupama, you talked a little bit about Prime Minister Modi's visit, and what I want to press on a little bit about is the timing of this visit, right? When a lot of things are going all over the place, when there are so many moving pieces, when there is various kinds of, as you mentioned, things are not obviously as dire in Nepal as they are in Sri Lanka, but when there is bad news coming out, right? In the middle of all of that, when you have a high-profile visit like this happen, it goes beyond just the optics of the visit become very important, right? Especially in this case, the visit was to Lumbini, right? Of significant cultural, historical importance to both the peoples, right? What is the message that's being given? And would you consider this being a carefully selected time, carefully selected visit that was designed to give out a certain kind of a message?
I wouldn't call it designed at this time because, since this government's first tenure, you see there has been a shift or re-emphasis in our relationship with Nepal. We have been concentrating on cultural relationship, cultural links, which one had, ignored in the past. And be it Hindu or Buddhist, both the linkages have been emphasized by this government as well as by Nepal also. So it is not something that it was India which was talking in terms of Ramayana circuit. Nepal also wanted it. I believe the first proposal had actually come from Nepal, and when Congress was in power. So they also wanted, so many international tourists come to India to visit like Buddhist sites, to visit Hindu sites also. So they would also want, if the circuit is there, so, tourists from India can go to Nepal. So this is an economic angle to it. There is a cultural angle. There was a time when Indian bureaucrats and others tried not to emphasize on the cultural aspect of it because Nepalese themselves didn't like it. They felt that they were getting submerged in the larger Indian cultural cultural influence. So they wanted to have, this was equated with that of sovereignty also, that they are independent, their Hinduism is different from that of Indian Hinduism, etc. Today, that is not the case. You see, it is not only Indian Prime Minister going and visiting religious sites. Prime Minister Dioba also visited Varanasi, for example. When President from Nepal came, she also went to Odisha to visit, temples there. So now it is both ways. So they realized that this is one aspect of the relationship that they do not have with China, actually. They may have economic relationship with China, political relationship with China, but this is something that they have exclusively with India. But close socio-cultural linkages does not mean close political relationship or some kind of complementarity in terms of their worldview or foreign affairs. So you have to nurture these relationships, and this is what I feel that right now, this is where I say that the shift in our relationship, where government is trying to emphasize in this aspect of relationship, saying that let us nurture it. At people to people level, it was always working, but not at the political elites level. So now they're starting to look into this aspect,
Ambassador Raghavan, if I can come to you and just step back and take a bigger look at the big picture, essentially. So many changes in so many South Asian states happening at the same time, and I'm trying to understand if there is some way of stringing them all together. Is there? Do you see some kind of commonalities in maybe the culture of the institutions, of the elites, of the politics that happens here, that brings these about or makes them more likely around the same time? Is there something like that in the milieu of the region?
To my mind, there is a general pattern, especially if we stand back from day-to-day developments, the contours of that pattern become visible. And that pattern is that South Asia, like other regions, this is not unique to South Asia, but certainly South Asia is being buffeted by larger geopolitical events over which it has very little control. Each of the constituent units of South Asia have very little control over the events which are really buffeting them from pretty comprehensively. And these developments are, of course, the pandemic, the Ukraine crisis, to a considerable extent, climate change, although that works in a more subterranean and longer term manner. But really, these three have come together in many senses in the past year or year and a half. And this has led to my mind, a certain element of greater stability creeping into bilateral relationships. Now, it is certainly the case that while there is an upstick in relations with Sri Lanka, with Nepal, perhaps with others too, there is a greater element of stability in relations with Pakistan following the ceasefire. This is not to say that the structural reasons or the structural issues which bedevil relationships in South Asia have disappeared. It is just that it has been put aside because we are in the midst, all of us are in the midst of this wider geopolitical churn over which none of us really has any real leverage in terms of controlling it. So that almost instinctively leads to trying to emphasize elements of stability and trying to impart greater stability to bilateral relationships. I think given the nature of neighborhood relations in South Asia, and again, this is not true of South Asia, but true of other regions, relations between neighbors are going to remain, are always very complicated, very difficult, and they are going to remain so. But there is a cyclical pattern to answer your question. And I think the pattern currently is that we are going to see much more stability or efforts to impart stability and put aside to the extent possible. It may not be always possible, and there may be always an unpredictable black swan kind of event which derails things, especially in India-Pakistan, but the effort will be to try to put it aside and to see as to how greater stability can be maintained, because certainly in the next year or two, we are not going to move into a phase where any of these major geopolitical trends are going to be ironed out. They are going to remain and will continue to impact us. We remain totally in the midst of the Ukraine crisis. What its consequences will be in the short term or the medium term, we can only guess at. And the impact of any significant downswing will be immediate and tremendous on South Asia, particularly because of the economic vulnerabilities we face. Similarly, the COVID recovery pattern is not going to be a linear one. No matter how much we try to talk it up about how quick recovery is, it's not going to be a linear pattern in any part of South Asia. And again, finally, the impact of climate change, the heat wave, the impact of that on food production, on demand for fertilizer, the water crisis, all these are going to be factors which are going to have political impact, political and economic impacts in the short and medium term.
If I can stay on with you, Ambassador Raghavan, and because we have already kind of talked about the role of India, which we will come back to in a bit, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the role of China, right, which has a special relationship, more so with Pakistan than with any other state in the region. And with the new government coming in, we saw the dismantling of the CPEC authority. And I will come to Nirupama and Sangeeta also about the question of China in these particular countries, Sri Lanka and Nepal. But how, Ambassador Raghavan, do you see the Pakistan-China relationship going forward? The dismantling of the authority, also China has been quite engaged with domestic issues, the question of leadership coming up later in the year, the entire effort towards zero COVID and so on and so forth. What kind of an imprint does it leave in the China-Pakistan equation?
I think the China-Pakistan relationship is not really negatively impacted. The dismantling of the authority is really a critique by the new government of its predecessor government, that it was not harnessing the relationship to Pakistan's advantage to the fullest extent, and they will be much better at it. It's by no means a critique of China or a critique of China-Pakistan relations. That relationship remains intact and will remain certainly of great importance in Pakistan's worldview. The fact is that that China is going to be a major factor in for Pakistan's economic development, and also to a great extent in its strategic projection, and nothing is going to change that. The Chinese are conscious of it. I think perhaps over the last 3 or 4 years, they have become a little more conscious in terms of the demands of Pakistan and of their own limitations in meeting those demands. The China-Pakistan situation is nowhere equivalent to India-Sri Lanka or India-Nepal, notwithstanding the excellent political relationship which exists between China and Pakistan. But the fact is, Pakistan is the 5th largest country in the world. There is no way that Chinese external assistance can ever become a substitute for what Pakistan first has to do in terms of improving its absorptive capacity of external aid. There is no way China can fix Pakistan's domestic issues. And I think in the past 4 or 5 years, the Chinese have become much more conscious of that than they were. But overall, I would say that China is going to remain a very important factor in Pakistan and for Pakistan. And indeed, if one moves away from the day-to-day and the tactical, it is going to remain precisely that, also for Nepal and Sri Lanka. And yes, while there are ups and downs, and I agree with Nirupama about how perhaps the Chinese overdid things in Sri Lanka, and there is a reaction to that. But the fact that the Chinese are a major economic power for each of our neighbors in South Asia, and each of our neighbors sees enormous potential in terms of their relations with China, I think that factor is going to remain. So I don't think we should in any way try to minimize that.
Nirupama, the same China question to you. And there's been a lot of writing which has kind of indicated that China is absent in Sri Lanka in the middle of this crisis, right? And it has not come up for its friend in the way that India has, right? You mentioned about how Wickremesinghe has more acceptability abroad, right? And if you can help us understand this, the Rajapaksas are seen as extremely pro-Chinese. Wickremesinghe coming in, what is that indicative of in terms of the China Sri Lanka relationship? Is there any kind of real change that we are seeing that is going to happen or is happening, and where to from here?
So as Ambassador Raghavan just pointed out, I don't think China Sri Lanka relationship can, has undergone that much of a change because of all this. Yes, there is a rethink in the highest at the highest levels of government that we've been too over-reliant on one partner, and we need to now cast a wider net to our friends, look for more friends. And of course India has been right there, and they've reached out to India, but China has invested too deeply in Sri Lanka for it to just disappear like that. China is developing a port city in Sri Lanka, which is right there. I mean, if the protesters are at Golface Green, is just across. I mean, they're just 500 meters away in the sea is the port city. It's coming up rapidly. China runs the port at Hambantota. They made they've developed it. It's been sold to them. They are in charge of Hambantota port. They have other great many other interests in Sri Lanka, and I think there is also, and there's a nuance here. I would like to say that not all the Rajapaksas are actually pro-China. There is a division between the brothers. Or at least so it seems to an observer like me, that Mahinda is the politician. Mahinda, who's the political animal among all the brothers, he is definitely more proximate to China than perhaps Gotabaya or Basil Rajapaksa. Basil Rajapaksa is actually right now an American citizen. Gotabaya used to be an American citizen, and he has told people in Sri Lanka, although he has given up his American citizenship in order to to contest the presidential election and then become the president, he believes that he will go back to the US and to spend time with his family when all this is over. So I don't think you can see the Rajapaksas as one solid pro-China family. There are divisions there, I believe. So it is that relationship, but that relationship continues to be quite solid. And although in the recent months, we have seen Sri Lanka and its political class turn to India for help. As Ambassador Raghavan pointed out, those are the problems that remain in the relationship have not entirely gone away. We have managed to tilt it a bit. The boat that was leaning to one side, we have managed to sort of bring it back to the center, perhaps. And in this process, of infusing so much money into Sri Lanka, we haven't called it a quid pro quo, nor are they saying quid pro quo, but a lot of people in Sri Lanka have seen this as a quid pro quo. So a long pending agreement for the joint development of Trincomalee, the oil storage facility at Trincomalee. It was mentioned in the 1987 Indo-Lanka Accord. India did not act on it for obvious reasons for a long time. And in 2002, when we started showing interest in it, Sri Lanka then was reluctant to actually operationalize it. And finally, that whole thing has become operational this January. So there is a question of timing. I mean, you can say that it is not a quid pro quo, but you can't really, you have to look at the timing as well. A long pending agreement for an electricity, for a power project at very close to Trincomalee in a place called Sampur. It has been awarded to NTPC. Adani is setting up a renewable energy park in two very key areas in the north, facing Tamil Nadu, in Mannar district and up there in Jaffna district. So all these things have suddenly started falling in place, and it is difficult to see those happening without this crisis. I don't think those would have come about had this crisis not happened. So there is an element of that, and people the press and the media in Sri Lanka has widely commented on this, saying, we have sold our assets for $1 billion, for $3 billion. So there is a sense that, this is transactional. But how can India turn this into something more substantive? I think, by offering to build self-sufficiency in Sri Lanka, by offering to, for instance, there is a huge fishermen's fishing problem between India and Sri Lanka, between northern Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu, to be more specific. And our fishermen go out into the Sri Lankan waters every 3 times a week, and they're there poaching in their waters. And they do. Our fishermen go in trawlers, and they do practice what is called bottom trawling. So kind of, ripping off the seabed really, and using double nets so that nothing really escapes from those nets. No living organism escapes. So this is a very heartfelt problem in northern Sri Lanka. And if India could reach out in some way and solve this problem, it would make friends. It would make friends if it reached out through agricultural, by offering its agricultural experts, its agricultural best practices in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a paddy growing nation. That is their main agricultural crop. India could once again, they tried this in the past and it failed, and they could once again offer to build milk self-sufficiency. All these are things that we could do to enhance that relationship. We have a great people-to-people relationship through all these difficulties. The India-Sri Lanka people-to-people relationship has not suffered. Unlike in Pakistan, where if the two countries fall apart, then there are no visas to be had. Like, I can't go there, nobody can, my friends can't come from there to see me. But between India and Sri Lanka, there's a huge people-to-people contact. And as Ms. Thapliyal was just mentioning, there is a huge religious tourism from Sri Lanka into India to see all the Buddhist sites, and in North India in North Sri Lanka to Tamil Nadu and all the other South Indian temples. So these are things that have existed, and we should actually use this moment when, for want of a better phrase, when the worm has turned a bit, to build on it, not in a purely transactional way, but to sort of bring bring the two countries to the two people closer without leaving that trace of suspicion that India is acting in its own self-interest, or it's acting in, these are all strategic moves that India is making. I'll just tell you one other thing. There's a very interesting thing going around you hear it more in the Tamil areas, that Sri Lanka should build a relationship with the 4 southern states of India, because these are the best performing states, and they are industrial states, most of them, and they're culturally very similar. So Sri Lanka should actually start building this relationship, focus on this relationship rather than, rather than a pan-Indian. Of course, it will be directed by the government of India, but this need to focus on the South India is coming out very strongly, especially in northern Sri Lanka.
We have audience questions coming in, which I will go to in a minute. Before that, Sangeeta, if I can come to you with the same China question that I asked the other 2 panelists, right? Now, when Mr. Wang Yi visited Nepal earlier in the year, one of the things that got reported quite a bit was about how in the agreements that were signed, there were no fresh loans for BRI projects, right? Yeah. If you can tell us a little bit about what we are seeing in the China-Nepal relationship, especially, again, given that there are troubles in Nepal as well. And just as in the case of Sri Lanka, we are not seeing China make a lot of noise about coming in or helping.
Yeah. First of all, you see, China's presence in Nepal increased tremendously after 2015, when India's relationship with Nepal had strained due to a few factors, and China had earlier accepted and recognized monarchy as the political force. After that, what we see that they started developing relations with all the other political parties, including parties from Madhesh, and that was something new thing that that development had taken place because of India's restrained relations with the government there. But we see that China started developing, that government started tilting. It was left government, communist government. It started tilting towards China, and then China came with they made efforts to bring in Maoist and Communist Party together. So this was something new that happened in Nepal, which had not happened earlier. So China was getting involved into certain sectors which it had not touched upon earlier. For example, hydropower was another sector which China had not entered earlier. So we see now, they started getting into that. Now, surprisingly, because of this 2015 episode, there was a slight shift in the Nepalese mindset also, especially people from the hill people. They started saying that why is there so much of dependence towards India? Let us, move towards other countries, open the northern border as well. And earlier they had only one trade and transit point, from where most of their trade was done. So now then they signed a lot of agreements, and they started talking about 9 transit points or trade points between Nepal and Tibet. So this was another thing that started happening. 2017 they signed BRI. Now Nepal has, when they signed BRI in 2017, and nearly 39 projects have been signed, their voices now started emerging within Nepal because they were looking at debt trap in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan. So they were very cautious of this. And they were now critiquing their government, which had not happened in the past. Believe me, Nepali press would never comment on anything, I'm not saying against China, but even criticizing or analyzing China. So they started doing that. And Nepal doesn't want loan. It prefers grants. Or otherwise it should be soft loans. So this is where the issue came up. And maybe because of COVID also, what we see that whatever projects they were getting involved in, they also slowed down. So now finally from 39, they have come down to 9 projects. And during Wang Yi's time, that 9 agreements were signed, but nothing related to BRI. So we see there that now there's a shift that is happening. This shift can also be due to change in government. Now you have a Congress government, which is not so pro-China. And you see that is why, it was easy for them to sign MCC. that MCC with US, and there were certain pro-China forces within Nepal who were against Nepal signing MCC, and there's a lot of issues in terms of whether it would be against or Nepali constitution, or Nepal's national interest would be hurt, or it is an extension of Indo-Pacific framework, strategic framework that US has. But keeping all that aside, we see that Kyoba finally was able to bring all these political parties together and ratify MCC in the parliament. So we see that shift taking place. So I don't think so. Now there was this awe of China that China delivers and India doesn't deliver. I think that is now fading away. I see that happening in Nepal.
Right. I'm going to begin taking some audience questions, and this is something that I'm going to come to all of you with. A lot of the news that we have been seeing in India about India's foreign policy and India's engagements has been about the Quad, has been about the Indo-Pacific, right? And Ambassador Raghavan, how does India reconcile its regional outreach while engaging with these plurilateral platforms, making these new kind of arrangements? How does that reflect in India's outreach to its neighbors in South Asia, to a Nepal, to a Pakistan, or to a Sri Lanka?
Well, to an extent, our relationships in South Asia remain insulated from what you do with the rest of the world. At the same time, there is a obvious complication that what you're doing with the rest of the world has a great deal to do with Chinese behavior in our region and also in South Asia. So that is really the dynamic with which the foreign ministry deals with on a regular basis. But to my mind, while arrangements such as Indo-Pacific, Quad, I think these have their own logic, and to some extent they are the outcome of earlier initiatives which were taken. But where the central fact which we face in South Asia today is really the change in orientation which is required in our mindsets, because our traditional approach always was that to the extent that we can keep great powers out of South Asia, the better it is for us and the better it is for South Asia. So you may not have been absolutely successful in keeping out great powers or great power presence from Nepal, from Pakistan, but certainly you tried to, and whenever there was too much of great power activity in Pakistan, you saw it as something inimical to your interests. So your general view was that let's try to keep everyone out of South Asia, because introduction of external rivalries into our immediate region is not a good development either for us or for our neighbors. I think that worldview has to now change, because you have a great power, whether we like it or not, in South Asia in the form of China. So that means that the way you approach your neighborhood cannot simply be in the old framework that we will do everything ourselves, because the Chinese economy is too strong a magnetic force for that to happen. So the question is, therefore, then how do you deal with that? Do you simply accept it and go along with the change? Do you try to resist it to the extent possible? Or do you deal with it? And one way of dealing with it is to bring in other powers also. Therefore, you deal more with the Japanese in South Asia, you deal with the Americans, you deal with the others, you try to build up linkages between South Asia and the Indo-Pacific. I think all these factors come into play. But more than anything else, this is a new kind of situation which has emerged in the past 8 to 10 years. And this is really going to be the direction of events for in the coming decades. That how do you link, it's no longer a question of how you deal with your South Asian neighbors, but how you fit in your bilateral relationships with South Asia, with other relationships you are forging with external powers.
Nirupama, in fact, your report earlier today in the Express about the Trincomalee port and the decision to develop it, right? So in view of what Ambassador Raghavan is saying, so is this one way in which maybe the Quad, which is talking about spending $50 billion over 5 years or so on infrastructure development and everything, is this an opportunity then for India to basically find partners, get into the region and do what, earlier, maybe a few years ago, one would have imagined only China to be able to do?
Yeah, I think that's what India has been doing for quite a few years now, at least for about 3 or 4 years. If I talked about that MOU that Ranil signed. I mean, the list of long list of agreements that Ranil signed in Delhi in 2017, and some of those agreements involved Japan. And when I asked someone in MEA as to why are we involving the Japanese, they said, well, there's a better way of actually getting this through, because Japan is probably more acceptable to Sri Lanka than India. But I'll tell you also in the Maldives, we have seen how the Maldives have embraced the US in recent years. There is now US. They have a defense pact with the US, and a few years ago that would have really riled India. And it did as well when there was speculation that this was going to happen. I think 2013 or so, there was some speculation that they were going to actually have a US Maldives defense pact was going to come through, and there was a lot of opposition. There was immediately a furor in the media, and it disappeared. But recently, I think in 2019, they signed this defense pact, Maldives and the US. And again, we do not say anything, we did not object. So it tells you that, as Ambassador Raghavan was saying, we see it now as a complementarity rather than as a rivalry. I mean, sort of joining hands, joining forces with like-minded powers who also see China as a rival, not just in the region, but in the wider region, in the Indo-Pacific. So in a sense, the objectives of Quad may not really be very different from India's strategic objectives in this region. Although at some stage, we may find that, okay, for instance, in Nepal, when they passed that MCC, when they agreed to sign the MCC in the Nepal Assembly, there was some talk about US becoming really influential. I mean, in India, there was some talk about it, about how US influence in Nepal is growing and what India must do to sort of balance that equation a bit. So we may find those problems coming up later, but for now, I think there is a definite complementarity. Yeah.
Okay. Sangeeta, similar question to you. You talked about the ratification of the MCC earlier. Along with that, we are seeing other things happen as well. We saw the US Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Usra Zia, who visited Nepal recently, visited Tibetan refugee settlements, and that got reported very widely in Nepalese newspapers. Since the 2008 Beijing Olympics, we had seen the Tibetan issue gradually falling off Nepalese newspapers earlier. What kind of, now as all of these things happen, it's not just an engagement with India, but also Nepal increasingly engaging with the bigger world through MCC and other initiatives. As this happens, how does India reconcile its engagements with Quad, in the Indo-Pacific, with its neighbors, like Nepal in this case?
In the case of MCC, there were some people within Nepal, political parties, etc., within Nepal, who were saying that it is part of Indo-Pacific strategy or quad, right? However, the situation became worse when a few statements came from, higher ups from US itself, like there's Assistant Secretary of State, two of them, I think, they made statements that MCC indeed was part of America's broader Indo-Pacific strategy. And then that was quoted and re-quoted a number of times, so that actually strained, that environment within the country. However, later on, in 12-point interpretive declaration was signed, and which those strictures actually explained and gave power to Nepal government that at any point of time, if government of Nepal feels that MCC goes against Nepal in national interest, then they can repeal it. Or if they so, and MCC is not above Nepal's constitution, for example, and it is definitely not part of Indo-Pacific strategy or quad. So, within Nepal, they have tried to take care of this situation. However, from India's side, first of all, our relationship with our neighbors has been bilateral in nature. Okay, even with Nepal. So it is bilaterally, at every level, we see engagement increasing. But I do not like to compare anything that whatever we are doing is because China is there. If you have a pipeline, because China is there, so we have a pipeline, and Indian newspapers go bonkers on it. Or, you have a rail linkage, road linkage. So once again, because China is there. China is there, but you have your own relationship with Nepal, consolidate that further, be it socio-cultural linkages, political linkages, economic linkages. The difference, of course, your military to military linkages, of course, it's already there. And we see that apart from bilateral relationship, India and Nepal are also active at sub-regional cooperation level. Be it, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal cooperation, or BIMSTEC. So these are certain, and they have actually signed Motor Vehicular Act also. So identify certain projects which help develop Nepal with some of these states, like Nirupama was saying, that's 4 southern states with Sri Lanka, that is enough. So similarly for Nepal, even 8 northeastern states of India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, that market is enough for them. It's a large enough market, So this is another way that India is approaching. Thirdly, now recently India has signed power agreement with Nepal, where now right now we are selling 600 megawatt of hydropower electricity to Nepal. But now once they develop, so we have agreed that we would, all private players actually, they would be able to sell power to India. And Bangladesh is also, keen to buy power. So once you have these transmission links, it would be easier for us to have that kind of grid, So I think these are certain measures through which you try to develop this entire sub-region. And that definitely will help Nepal and Bhutan.
We are almost at the end of our time, but with permission from all three of you, I'm going to pitch a question which is originally to Mr. Raghavan, but if I'd like really short answers from all of you. And essentially the question is, how much power, heft, clout, influence does India really have? Because we have been hearing for the last quite a few minutes, we have been hearing some great ideas to develop relationship with all the neighbors. And the question essentially is, how much can India really influence developments in the neighborhood? Ambassador Raghavan, why don't you go first?
Well, very good question. I think with each of our neighbors, we have a different quality of relationship. So the extent of how much influence you bring to bear varies from country to country. But in general, I think India has a certain role in South Asia in terms of standard setting. And this applies even to your worst bilateral relationship, which is with Pakistan. That historically, domestic developments in India have became a kind of a standard for Pakistan. So if you look at, let's say, since the 1970s, 1980s, the development of your election commission, the role which the Auditor General started to play, the kind of positions which your Supreme Court was taking, all of it was never agreed to. It was always It was a subtext, it was subterranean, but the fact is it became a kind of a standard. So you have enormous narrative power in South Asia. And I think we overlook that narrative power to our own disadvantage. So the strength of your pluralism, the strength of your domestic secular approach, the strength of your democratic institutions, these are the real building blocks of your power and influence in South Asia. Because if your narrative value gets corroded or eroded, certainly the reduction of political influence will follow from that. I don't think it's a simple question of how much your economic assistance or your political assistance or the nature of your defense relationship is. I think with South Asia, given the kind of civilizational and cultural ties you have, this narrative strength which you have traditionally had, to safeguard that is essential. And the best way of safeguarding that is to look within and strengthen our own institutions.
Okay. Narrative power and standard setting. Nirupama, same question to you.
Really, I would, it's the same answer almost. I mean, it's Ambassador Raghavan has said it all. I think India's heft in the region comes from its, of course, its economic size, but also its democracy, its resilience as a plural, diverse country, its ability to absorb all these languages, these religions, and present it as one big democratic country. And I think in the last few years, if we have lost some of this influence, I think it's because our democracy is seen to have in some ways diminished. Our democratic practices, our pluralism, our secularism is seen to have diminished. And therefore, our outreach to these countries, or they're looking to India for inspiration, for norms, for standard setting, as Ambassador Raghavan called it, are all sort of have got eroded. I'll just say, I'll include one comment I heard from a protester in Colombo. I was speaking to her, and she said, your government is helping Rajapaksa. So I said, how do you say that? We sent money because you need goods, you need fuel, and that's what the money is being used for. No, we think that they're helping each other because in some senses, there's a broad political alignment between them. So this is exactly the kind of comparison that we don't want. We don't want our government to be compared to, a government like that in some other country. And also we saw with the CAA how a domestic, something that was aimed at a domestic audience, or, it was supposed to be meant for, it was domestic policy, and what kind of impact it had in Bangladesh. It immediately put a hex on our relations with Bangladesh. The foreign minister, who was supposed to come on a visit at that point to India, December 2019, he did not come because he said, no, this is an anti-Bangladesh legislation. So there are these questions, and I think the way to resolve this is to regain our strength as a democratic, plural, secular country, and strength and diversity.
Okay, Sangeeta, last word.
Yeah, I think the case of India-Nepal relations is a slight difference because India and Nepal are too close to each other at various levels. At cultural, people-to-people level, that is fine because our borders are open. Nepalese can come to India, they get different kind of treatment, a similar kind of treatment which is given to an Indian citizen. So the relationship is slightly different here. Secondly, the political elite, both Nepali Congress, Indian National Congress, communists from there, they participate participated together in India's freedom movement. So there is a kind of ideational linkages that exist. Of course, that relationship is now no more, as strong as that was earlier, where political leaders could just pick up phone and talk to each other. So that has somehow lessened. Military to military is of course there, but the problem is the same closeness also creates problem, because that India is seen as a very large actor in Nepal. And so, for example, if you will have friends in every political party. If they look up to you, ask for advice, someone who's not in power will look at it as an interference. So immediately, you get into this framework of interference. So the dilemma is, where does this friendly advice end and interference begin? So there is this kind of framework in India-Nepal relationship and Nepal sovereignty, which of course there is a sovereign independent country, but it has to be respected at all the times, and at the same time India's strategic interests. So our relationships have been working within this framework. At any point of time you feel that Nepal feels, oh, there is interference, so it will hurt that strategic sensitivity that India is really very particular about. What is the way forward? So I think you cannot show hard power in Nepal. So it has to be your soft power approach that will take you a long way. Secondly, we have identified, for example, hydropower as one of the area. But we realize that major projects that have been signed with Nepal have been into some controversy or the other. On the other hand, smaller projects have done pretty well. But we somehow have not been able to tell people and educate them that there are success stories as well. So I think what is important is that India should go ahead with those projects which are more people-centric. Which is like, and they are doing it now. For example, laying schools, setting up schools, or laying roads, or things like that. Which actually connects us to the people, and that is your part. But there is little India in Nepal, and there is little Nepal in India. So this relationship is very different.
All right, we are way beyond our allotted time. Dr. Sangeeta Thapliyal, Nirupama Subramanian, Ambassador TCA Raghavan, thank you very much for joining us and for your insights. And thank you everyone for joining us on this edition of India and the World. We will be back soon with another iteration. Do join us then again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.